It's recording. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to the second talk in this year's series of Talk Grasslands. Last week, we had the presentation by Santiago Oliveras Codina on biodiversity functioning relationships in grasslands and elsewhere. That is now uploaded on YouTube, so for any of you who missed it, it's now accessible there. Today's presenter is Alicia Acosta, and she will be talking to us about Mediterranean coastal dunes, threats and trends. And this presentation will also be available on YouTube soon afterwards. So please, Alicia, the screen is yours.
I will try to share my presentation. Let's see.
Yep, perfect.
Did you see it? Okay.
Yes, it's fine.
Let's see if I can also share this. Well, thank you, Stephen, for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here in front of this active group of our association. I start just saying 2 words about myself. I took my degrees in Córdoba University in Argentina, where I started working as plant ecologist, mainly with mountain grasslands, as also with dry forest. Then I moved to Italy, where I've been working for the last 30 years. I'm still here in Rome Tre University, working mainly in coastal areas. This is a very general talk. I organized this talk in 3 parts. First of all, I propose an outline of coastal dune systems. Then a brief description of the vegetation of Mediterranean coastal dunes, with emphasis in the Italian ones that are those I know better. Then I will talk about what we already know about temporal changes in coastal dunes, using both remote sensing and field data. And finally, we'll move to major threats with focus on alien species. I should say that most of this presentation is mainly based on our previous works. Well, coastal dunes are distributed worldwide, all over the world. In this figure, you can see well-developed coastal dune systems in green. Sandy shores and dunes could be found almost in all latitudes, climates, and biomes. They range from polar to tropical latitudes and from desert to rainforest. Sandy beaches are often associated with a wide range of dune forms and dimensions. And this is a nice example of dune system, but in the Atlantic coast of Europe. Here we are in France, close to Bordeaux. In the Mediterranean, dunes are often much more modest. They generally occupy a narrow strip along the seashore, and they are usually not very high, with a very simple structure. Sandy beaches begin at the seashore, followed by small embryo dunes. Then one or more shifting dunes reach, and finally fixed dunes in the more inland part. Sandy shores, we say, we present different communities. We have different plant communities because we are along the transition between the terrestrial and the marine worlds. And this is a key point here, because environmental factors such as salinity, substrate, wind action vary from the seaside to inland, forming so a steep directional gradient of stress and natural disturbance. This strong gradient promote the coexistence of different plant communities in a quite small area. And this complex and compressed vegetation zonation is one of the major features of coastal dunes. And it's also one of the reasons they are so unique. This zonation ranges from pioneer annual communities on the drift line to more inland communities, for example, the Mediterranean scrubs, in the inner part of fixed dunes. You should know that this zonation is rarely well known or relatively well known and has been described by different authors using different approaches. If you are interested in the coastal zonation and this in particular about the herbaceous part of the coastal zonation, there is a nice synthesis in this paper published by Corrado Maceno and colleagues. Most of these plant communities have been included in the Annex 1 of the Habitats Directive. And in this presentation, I will mainly talk about habitats. Starting from the sea line towards inland, the first habitat we found is the annual vegetation of drift lines or upper beach. This habitat is occasionally submerged by water in winter storms. So it includes few pioneer plants, mainly vascular plant species, which represent the first stages of vascular plant colonization. Here I show you Cacile maritima, the most common species in this habitat. Following along the coastal zonation, we find the embryonic shifting dunes. In this case, are characterized by perennial grassing, often dominated by Thinopyron usum that started the first sand accumulation. Thinopyron usum changed its name several times in recent years, as you can see here below. Then follows shifting dunes with Ammophila arenaria, now Calamagrostis arenaria, at least in Italy, which is one of the most typical and representative species in coastal dunes. But I'm still use the old name. I don't get used to Calamagrostis, so I will use Ammophila here in this presentation. Going further in the transition between shifting dunes and the Mediterranean scrub, we can find the Crucianellium maritim fixed dunes and Malcometalia grasslands. Moreover, we could find also another habitat, the great dunes, perennial grasses with many lichens and mosses. I should note that this habitat is quite common in the Atlantic coast, but it's very rare in the Mediterranean, probably only present in the North Adriatic Sea. If you are interested in this habitat, there is also a very nice paper by Silvia Belvecchio and colleagues. And in this talk, I will try to concentrate on herbaceous coastal dune communities, but I would like to show you the complete coastal dune zonation that follows with Mediterranean scrub, the Mediterranean margin on fixed dunes. And finally, in the inner part, more sheltered from weeds and soil spread, we could find also woodlands. Corcuzilla is probably the most common tree species, sometimes substituted by pines. Well, we are in the transition between the terrestrial and the marine world. So this is a harsh environment. Living here is not easy for plants. They should face dryness, nutrient shortage, salt spray. So many environmental constraints. So plant species are often very specialized and sometimes exclusive of coastal dunes. This means we can find them only here and not in other places. This is also a key point that contributes to make the biodiversity of coastal dune very special and we can say unique. Marta Garboni and colleagues analyzed the distribution of special species along the coastal zonation, applying different specialization indices. We found a significant variation in the degree of specialization along the sea-inland gradient. Special species dominated close to the sea in the most extreme conditions, while generalists were dominant more inland in the more sheltered inner part of this zonation. I would like to show you at least one of these special species. I selected this one I mentioned before, and I realized it's not the most beautiful species, but in my opinion, it's one of the most interesting species, Ammophila arenaria. And I used to call it the queen of coastal ecosystems. Ammophila leaves bend during the hottest hours of the day, and the stomata are located in the bottom of cavities covered with hairs in the inside face of the leaf, an adaptation that you probably know in plants of steppes or desert. But the most extraordinary adaptation of this species is linked to burial. Plants growing in dunes not only have to face dryness, lack of nutrients, and so on, other constraints, but also with burial by sun. Burial is frequent event in coastal dunes, and many plants can tolerate certain amounts of sun. Actually, some plants are stimulated by burial, and species like Ammophila are able to grow not only laterally, but also vertically, an upward extension in response to burial, holding in this way the sun. Of course, dune species vary in their tolerance limits, but some studies have demonstrated that species like Ammophila can stand up 1 meter of burial per year. This is why plants adapted to live in dune ecosystem play a major role in dune formation and dune morphology. And we can call them dune builders. So coastal dune plants, such as Ammophila again, provide to dune formation holding the sun, and in this way contribute to essential services such as protection against erosion, coastal erosion, and reducing damage due to storm. For example, when we have intense and very strong storm during winters, which are always, in each year we see are more frequent and more intense. When we lose this kind of species, we are losing also more quantities of land. Our studies have been mainly focused on vascular plants, but we have also investigated other taxonomical groups. Bryophytes have been largely studied in the Atlantic coast, where lichen and mosses are very common. However, they are less known for the Mediterranean. Valeria Murru and colleagues analyzed biophytes along the coastal dune vegetation zonation in a well-preserved study area in Sardinian island in Italy. She detected a total of 18 different species and described for the first time the distribution along Mediterranean dune vegetation zonation. Note here that there are not bryophytes close to the sea. The first ones were in dune grasslands, with the high number of species, we found it in the Mediterranean scrub. But what about animals? Coastal dune fauna is also very interesting and worth to be mentioned. I just showed you two little birds, Caradius dubius and Caradius alexandrinus. Both of them nest on the beach and so are really very endangered. British greenie, it's a night butterfly, also typical of coastal dunes. This butterfly feeds only on a dune plant, the sea lily, Pancratium maritimum, And finally, I mentioned a coleoptera group, the tenebrionids, probably the most conspicuous insects living in the Mediterranean coastal habitats. Some years ago, Simone Fattorini and colleagues showed that the distribution of these tenebrionids followed the coastal dune vegetation zonation. It's quite interesting because these species are distributed along the zonation with more or less strict preferences for particular dune habitats. And moving now to the second part of this talk, despite of the wide global distribution, coastal dunes experience many transformations, in particular since the second half of last century. But what has happened? To analyze temporal changes, we used different approaches. The first one was remote sensing techniques. Marco Malavasi and colleagues, using aerial photographs, quantified landscape changes on dune cover types in 3 days, 1954, 1986, and 2010. So covering more or less 60 years. Well, I should say that it's not easy to identify coastal dune habitats using aerial photographs, but it's possible to map at least 3 natural land cover types: beaches with pioneer annual vegetation close to the sea, herbaceous dune vegetation, including most of the habitats we've seen before, and woody dune vegetation. We observe a strong temporal decrease for the last 2 cover types represented by bars in this figure, and this means habitat loss. On the other side, an increment in the number of patches, dots in this figure, that means habitat fragmentation. Moreover, we observe that agriculture, afforestation, and urban expansion have replaced natural dune cover types. The first ones are mainly concentrating in the inner sectors of the coastal zonation. In contrast, urban expansion involves the whole landscape with no preference for any particular dune cover type. So we can say that the typical sea inland grading, which constrains plants, also shape human activities somehow. Well, we also use field data to analyze temporal changes, but with different approaches. First, permanent plots, in our case, permanent tracks from 2010, we've been monitoring coastal communities using belt transits. These transits belong to the European long-term ecological research network. And we also use historical data, phytosociological releves performed in the past since the 60s and included in a national vegetation database, we call it VEC dunes, with almost 3,000 releves. And finally, we also conduct revisitation studies. As you can see, different approaches, different data, different analysis. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to present you all of them. So I prepared a brief summary, and I will show you only main results, focusing on the most recent ones. In 2002, we started to perform vegetation random plots with standard SAT and georeference with GPS. This was the beginning of Rambek Dunes, that was a vegetation database that included only random plots. So a different database I mentioned before, VEC Dunes, that included only phytosociological releves conducted by different people. In 2017, Marta Gaya Sperandi started with the resampling of the oldest random plots. And let's see main results. We found that almost 1/4 plots disappeared. This means that when we went to relocate the plot, we couldn't find it because the site was completely unvegetated or submerged by the sea. About the 70% of the disappeared plots belong to the upper beach or embryo dunes communities. This is the first part of the coastal zonation I said before. And note that these results were obtained only in 10, 15 years after the first survey. And trying again to condense other results, I can say that we observed that the typical dune species were affected in all habitats. Fast-growing species, often annuals, but also ruderals and non-native species, substitute typical dune species. The dune buildings, as Ammophila we've seen before. So, very important species loss was verified. Moreover, we observed that most pioneer habitats were particularly at risk. And if you remember the results we've seen at landscape level, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and replacing by other land cover types, we can say that our analysis demonstrated strong changes at landscape, habitat, and at the species level. In few words, an extraordinary biodiversity loss and also a loss of key ecosystem functions. I'll show you results in Italy, but what about conservation status of European coastal dunes? In 2016, the European Red List of Habitats reports that most of the coastal habitats are threatened, except cliffs and rocks. In particular, in the Mediterranean, around the 50% of the coastal habitats are at risk. And you probably know, according to the Article 17 of the Habitats Directive, every 6 years, European states are required to report on the conservation status and trends in target habitat and species. In this table, you can see that the last overall habitat assessment, and this is at biogeographic level, and where I evidenced the Mediterranean region, most of coastal dune habitats are highlighted in red. This means that the overall assessment is unfavorable or bad. And moving now to the third and final part of this talk about threats, unfortunately, we could mention a large list of threats. The coastal zones of Europe are highly populated, and many large cities have been built in coastal areas. Not surprisingly, urbanization is the most important threat to all coastal habitats. And according to the European Red List of Habitats, we can see that recreational use of people is one of the following. In fact, during the last century, tourism has increased enormously and still is a growing activity with great economic potential. I think I can insist in this threat, but I talk about another threat, invasive avian species, that is the fifth, according to this report, in coastal dune habitats. Silvia Juliet and colleagues analyzed patterns of invasion across coastal dunes at European level, so considering Mediterranean, Atlantic, Baltic, and the Black Sea. Silvia used more than 20,000 releves from shifting dunes and dune grasslands, using the European Vegetation Archive, EVA, and quantify richness, frequency, and distribution of neophyte species. We observed that alien species richness was higher in the Atlantic, in light blue in this figure, respect to the Mediterranean in red. And North America was the main donor of alien plants for the Mediterranean. Among the most frequent non-native species, I can mention Erigeron canadensis, Inotera biennis, group biennis, and Carpobrotus edulis. And if we focus in Italy, using VecDunes, the National Vegetation Database I mentioned before, we extracted 39 alien species. And amongst the most frequent ones, I could mention Yucca gloriosa, Agave americana, Inotera group biennis, and Carpobrotus edulis and Carpobrotus acinosiformis. But what about invasion dynamics? Silvia Gascone and colleagues using data from the Buisabre project we've seen before explored changes in invaded coastal dune habitats over the last 10, 15 years. Using rand abundance curves, we compare invaded old plots in green in this graphic with new plots in red. An interesting result is that the number of alien species doubled over the time. We have 6 aliens in the old plots, but 12 in the new ones. Moreover, 2 invasive aliens, Yucca gloriosa and Agave americana, strongly increase in cover. Note also that we had only 1 dominant alien in both dates, Carpobrotus, considering here together the 2 species present in Italy, Carpobrotus edulis and Carpobrotus acinosiformis. They are South African species distributed throughout Europe. You can see in this map Carpobrotus edulis with yellow flowers, red points in this map, and Carpobrotus acinosiformis with magenta flowers with green points in this map. The identification of these 2 species is still subject of debate, and they are still taxonomical problem. If you are interested in this alien species, you can see this review with Josefina Campoy from Spain as leader author. In any case, we have already accumulated many evidence regarding the impact of Carpobrotus on native coastal dune communities. We know that it's quite a problematic species, and many authors have studied it all around the world. I just mentioned these 2 papers of Thomas Hooker and Ricardo Santoro. We can say that we not only observe a negative relation between Carpobrotus invasion and native species diversity, but we also observe impacts on soils with significant difference between invaded and non-invaded plots for different soil parameters. And is still insisted with Carpobrotus, Simona Sarmati and colleagues investigated if there were differences in the impact of these 2 species, edulis and acinosiformis, on native plant diversity. In this case, vegetation sampling was carried out through pair plots, and then we compare invaded and non-invaded ones. As we expected, results confirm a general decrease in native species richness in all the invaded plots respect to the non-invaded ones. However, there were no significant difference between the 2 species, plots invaded with Carpobrotus edulis and those invaded by Carpobrotus acinosiformis. So, we could confirm that Carpobrotus is a problematic invasive species. However, it is still very, very popular. I will show you just few examples. It is planted in some beach areas. It is still the star of posters. This is Sardinian Island. And it has been selected as an iconic plant for this very important emblematic wine of the Elba Island in Italy. And going towards the end of this talk, the last threat I'm going to mention is pollution, in particular beach litter. Sandy shores are usually considered important sinks for floating debris. Some years ago, we also tried to investigate this threat, although we realized this was quite challenging for vegetation ecology. Gianluca Poeta and colleagues analyzed beach litter in Central Italy, and sampled litter was performed using the same random plot we use for vegetation study. We observed that plastic and polystyrene were the most common litter items, which confirmed that plastic is one of the most diffused marine litter worldwide. But there was also an interesting result here. Could you guess, this is a question, which was the most frequent plastic item? Many people answer plastic bottles, cups, but instead, the most frequent plastic item was cotton bag. In fact, the title of one of Gianluca's papers was The Cotton Bad's Beach. There were also differences in the spatial distribution of the litter along the coastal zonation. Pioneer habitats showed that higher levels of litter accumulation was mainly concentrated on the first part of the coastal zonation. And this result has important practical consequences. But why? Because beach cleaning actions are concentrated mostly in this area, the first part of the coastal zonation. Mechanical cleaning techniques, the most common one, do not allow the distinction between litter and living plants or animals. Everything is removed, and leaving just loose sand ready to be blown away by the wind. Therefore, beach litter constitute an indirect threat to coastal vegetation through mechanical cleaning. I always insist mentioning this threat because mechanical cleaning could be easily avoided or relatively easily avoided. Other threats, such as alien species, are much more difficult or much more expensive to remove. Well, we have a right to take home messages. Coastal dunes are very interesting ecosystems due to the unique biodiversity they host, and because they provide crucial ecosystem services. However, they have undergone consistent transformation in recent years. We observe an extraordinary biodiversity loss. All coastal habitats are currently considered to be very endangered, which unfortunately raise concerns over the fate of dune habitats. These transformations compromise not only biodiversity, but also the possibility to deliver key supporting services such as erosion control. But there are also other contributions to people that I could mention. A beautiful beach in front of the sea could be also important for your physical and your mental health. And why not for your spirit, as Oriental people teach us? Conserving biodiversity can actually preserve those instinctive values and recreational space for outdoor activities that people seek in coastal areas, me inclusive. Conservation of this ecosystem should not be in conflict with economic interests, which are obviously very important here. On the contrary, if beaches are managed properly, the ecosystem benefits could be used for a longer period, could last longer. could be also more inclusive. And after all, they will remain for future generations. Okay, thank you very much. I can
Thank you very much, Alicia.
my presentation.
It's very interesting and enjoyable. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, Serkut.
Oh, hi, Jürgen.
Hi. I was gonna ask that how does the invasive species are distributed? If you mentioned it, I couldn't catch up. I'm sorry.
Why they are a problem? They change fields because we observe, we took samples of soil in invaded and non-invaded plots, and we analyzed different soil parameters, and we observed, for example, that the pH was much lower in invaded plots. We also observe different value for other soil parameters, and moreover, a kind of homogenization of all habitats, of this example from soil of all habitats, that in non-invaded plots were quite different. Sorry, I don't know if that was your question.
I was trying to ask that how the plants are distributed as invasive species within habitats.
Well, we can find invasive species, sorry, in all habitats, but there is a concentration of alien species in the middle part of the coastal zonation in dune grasslands. But they are distributed in all habitats. Sometimes they are different. The alien species we find in woody habitats are different from those from grassland. Sometimes are the same. For example, Carpobrodus, we can find Carpobrodus everywhere in the whole coastal zonation.
Understand. Thank you.
This was something that I also found quite interesting. Like, I also do work as an urban ecologist, and in northern European cities, we find that almost all of the alien plant species that are established are from southern Europe. So it was interesting that for these dune systems, that most of the alien species are from the Americas. And
yes.
I wonder, is that because they're the regions where many garden plants are imported to these different areas? Is there some other
Yes.
explanation?
We see not for coastal plant, only for coastal, but for in general for the Mediterranean, that North America was the main donor of alien plants. And we interpret this because the exchanges, mainly in recent years of Europe, are with North America. So probably one of the main reasons of that. I add that, for example, even though we have more or less the same alien species, in Italy, the Tyrrhenian coast and the Adriatic coast, we have some difference. For example, Carpobrodus is most common in the Tyrrhenian coast, and Enotera is most common in the Adriatic coast. In Northern Europe, you have, for example, Rosa rugosa that came from Japan.
Yes, it's a big problem here in Finland.
I know it's a very big problem. And we started to have it in the Mediterranean, but only in the North Adriatic. We've seen for the first time Rosa rugosa. I don't think that the climate here is different, and I don't think that it will be a problem, but who knows? Yes.
Yeah. Does anybody else have questions?
Can I ask?
Sure.
Let it be Svetlana. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alicia, for this interesting talk about this very interesting and special habitat. I wanna continue this topic about invasive species and ask, are there any species which are natural for Mediterranean, for example, region, invasive in other parts of the world?
Yes, yes, yes. First of all, for example, we consider in Europe that some Mediterranean species could invade the rest of Europe, no? But we know some Mediterranean species that is not only Mediterranean because it's found with another subspecies along the Atlantic coast. Ammophila arenaria, I mentioned before. We know it was planted in North America, it was planted in South Africa, it was planted in New Zealand, it was planted in Australia, and became invasive. And this very, very problematic plant because many authors have studied, for example, in the west coast of the United States, and we know that it's a dangerous species that has an impact on native biodiversity, but it's very, very difficult to remove because of what I said before, because it has this row, lateral and vertical, it's very difficult to remove. And if you remove, they have done some experiments removing Ammophila, and were not successful because the removal produced a very big disturbance. We are in sand, so it removes everything. So Ammophila is a clear example of an European species that invades in other countries of the world. Ammophila is the most iconic example, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
And I have another question.
Yes.
Why you said that this middle part of this coastal dune zones, I mean, it's probably these shifting dunes, they
Yes.
are most affected by invasive species. Why?
Well,
Why?
not the shifting dunes. I would say we observe higher numbers in the transition dune grassland, great dunes. Probably because the environment is not so harsh there, are medium, intermediate environmental conditions, and it's not the woody habitat there is more shade there. And in this intermediate situation, we observe a higher number. In any case, I insist, alien species, we found alien species in the whole zonation. No places without alien species, unfortunately. They are one of, is considered, coastal dunes are considered among the most invaded habitats also. Not only threatened, but also invaded habitats, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Ali, would you like to ask a question?
Can I?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alicia, for very interesting report. And my question is about what do you think of a nearest future? Maybe some outlooks for the preserving of these dunes, Mediterranean dunes, coastal dunes in the future, or maybe their biodiversity. What measures do you propose? What do you think? It's a philosophical, I think, kind
Yes,
of
yes.
question, but what do you think?
Difficult because there are, as I said, many economical interests in the dunes, because for Mediterranean country, coastal dunes, coastal beaches are an important financial of incomes, no, for at all levels, no, at the local levels, regional level, at national level. So that's why there are these important interests that are very difficult to fight. So, but I insist in, that's why I insist, for me, if the easy things to do, not very expensive, is not to plant because Carpobrotus is still planted, or mechanical cleaning, I think it really has a terrible impact on dunes. So if the cleaning, we need to clean beaches, of course, because people don't like to go to a dirty beach, but the cleaning could be made manually, for example. It's more expensive, of course, yes, but should be very, very important. And also higher levels of protection in protected areas, higher levels of protection, because sometimes there are no controls, there are not enough controls in this area. So one important thing I say that if we protect the first part of the coastal zonation, and there are cheap ways to do that, just fence. People don't, or don't, I don't that people don't go, but at least trampling is not so high, and these communities have the possibility to recover quite, I wouldn't say easily, but in a period relatively short. So in a short period of time, we have, if they are fenced, if they are protected, we can have again not a well-conserved dune system, but they start to recover more easily. Also passive recovery. You don't need to plant dune builders. That could be also expensive, but just in this case, this is a kind of ecosystem that passive recovery could be effective, I think.
Mhm.
Well,
Yes,
more or
thank
less.
you. Thank you. But maybe at a bigger level, bigger dimension, when we take into account sea level rise and climate change. So what do you think is about these factors?
Well, sea rise for sure is a problem. For sure it's a problem for oceanic coast. In the Mediterranean is not so clear, I would say. Of course, they will suffer rise, but I've seen. I'm not an expert on this subject, but I've seen some reports that say that in the Mediterranean the sea rise will be not so intense, or would be not so intense as in oceanic coast. So it could be a problem, but perhaps not such a big problem for the Mediterranean, because when the sea will rise enough to cancel our dunes, if we are still going with this trend, they will be canceled by other factors before.
Okay, oh, thank you. And last question, did you use, as I understand, you mentioned Earth remote sensing tools methods. Did you use them in your study?
Yes, I show you that with aerial photographs, and in our group, there is a young collaborator that is also working with satellite images. Also. Yes, I'm not an expert in this, but in our group, that some people is also working, especially to consider trends in time. to see what has happened during the last years. The study I showed you was performed some years ago and comprised just a sector of central Italy. Instead, we are going to expand this analysis with remote sensor to a bigger area, at least. We would like to work at the national level.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Alireza, did you have a question or was it already covered?
Yeah, I think that it's already
Alireza.
covered. So, yeah, hello. Sorry, maybe do you have still time for a short question?
I have time. I don't know if we have time for
yeah.
Yes, we have time.
Nice to see you again, Alicia. I really enjoyed your presentation. Just have a very basic ecological question. Could we say dune system or dune type of vegetation is a kind of seasonal vegetation, just influenced by more soil rather than climate?
A difficult question. A difficult question, Alireza. In my opinion, I would say that, of course, local environmental factors. In particular, we are, as I said before, the transition between the sea and terrestrial ecosystem. So for terrestrial ecosystem, this is a very important constraint. So I think that the local factors related to the vicinity to sea are the most important ones. So we can find our typical species as Ammophila arenaria in the whole Mediterranean and up to, I don't think if I write to Norway, but close to the North Sea, it arrives also. Not so common, but it arrives to the North Sea. So very different climate. Of course, when we go in the inner part of the coastal dunes, this influence of the sea is not so high. So climatic factors are more important. So in the Mediterranean, we have this goody habitat I show you, scrubs and different kind of that. In Northern Europe, but
thank you.
The first part, yes, it is.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Mikita has the next question.
I'm very grateful for this very interesting lecture, and I have two questions. First of them, I read about catastrophic increasing level of light pollution along these seashores. Did you notice any impact on vegetation of coastal dunes or something similar?
Well, to tell you the truth, no. No, I know the Black Sea coastal dunes. I suppose that this kind of pollution now would be diffused, perhaps. But really, I don't know, because at least in the Mediterranean, I have not seen papers regarding the impact of this kind of pollutants on coastal dunes. Only solid pollutants, not liquid ones, for example. I unfortunately, I can't answer you.
Okay, thank you. And the second question, it seems you know everything about coastal dunes. So,
I don't know everything.
I would like to ask you what questions remains open for you? In other words, what are you going to study in the future or study right now?
Yes, I have a clear answer for this. because we have already started, and that's what we would like to do next year, to revisit again coastal use, but in a wider way, starting for the whole Italian peninsula, and why not the Mediterranean. We have already made a call for different colleagues to revisit resurvey of coastal use, because we started to do it, as I show you, but we would like to do this going back in time, not only the last 10 years, but going back with phytosociological relevance, and to expand this, because we are seeing that coastal dunes are very threatened, as I showed you. I don't know the fate of this. We are trying, but we don't know which will be the fate of coastal dunes. So we urgently need to know the part of biodiversity we are losing, because we can speak a lot about biodiversity loss, but we have to have more data on what has been our biodiversity, what we have lost from the past. In Italy, just in Italy, we have more than 2,000 releves made from the 60s. And so we have a lot of data. So we would like to go through this direction, through this aim.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd also like to ask something about these conservation aspects. That clearly the tourism is probably the biggest danger to these habitats, but in much of Europe, we're seeing in tourism industry now making quite a big thing about sustainable tourism. So to extent it might be greenwashing, but there's a lot of tourism companies that are trying to compete with how sustainable the tours that they arrange are. Is it so that there's nothing really happening at that end, that it would be nice if these big tourist companies that have a lot of economic influence would have input into these areas to say that we want clean beaches with interesting habitats nearby them. We want that our work is supporting biodiversity. Is there anything like that happening, or is it something that could happen?
No, I don't know anything about that. I know that in Sardinia, in the islands, some people are trying to do similar kind of things. But I know only one example. I insist, Stephen, in education, because people do not know. When they see an Ammophila species, they say just a grass, a weed. So I think that should be also for the tourism, should be more education, because even though people know, I think that everybody that works with grasslands know that people know that when someone cuts a tree, they realize there's something not so good cutting that tree. But when someone came and blow away Ammophila with a truck, it's normal, you know. So I think that still we have a lot to do for the conservation of these environments. Really, I think that the situation is really critical. I simply believe that the situation is really critical, even though the important services, because if I put a hotel instead of the dunes. It's not the same for coastal erosion. They are rigid structures. So that erosion now is one of the biggest problems in Mediterranean coast, not only biodiversity. So difficult things, but so I try to insist with these cheap, easy things, fence, not mechanical cleaning, not to plant alien species, and other things are difficult to control because the financial money here is very, very, very important.
Sure.
A lot.
Yeah.
It's not like other areas that are people, tourists. People need go to the beach, need go to.
Sure.
Yeah. But
it could be done
very difficult.
sustainably.
Yeah. Very difficult.
Okay, we've gone over the time that was planned. I will stop the recording now.